Okay, so this is going to be an advertisement for a paper, not a presentation of a paper or a movie trailer. We'll show you some things we blow up and some relationships that we put in doubt and raise lots of questions and hopefully intrigue you enough to take a look or better yet talk to us, because we'd really like this to be a thing. So we are thinking about the question of how are we going to regulate increasingly powerful AI systems. We talk about this in the AI domain sometimes as AI safety. That's thinking about a wide range of things. I mean, it's not just how do we make sure it doesn't blow us all up, but also how do we make sure it's well aligned with human values and so on. Part of the challenge that we're facing with very fast-moving, innovative technologies, globalized, digitized, high rates of innovation, high rates of complexity, which are things that we've been dealing with in transformations over the last several decades, are simply ramped up tremendously with AI. And a starting point for this work is the idea, look, actually our existing regulatory technology is not well adapted to regulate this new environment. And so we can continue thinking about, okay, what legislation should we get Congress or parliaments to pass, and what existing agencies, how should we change their current remit? Maybe we need to create new agencies. How do we play out that model? And I think a key point, and this is actually coming out of work that I was doing previously before thinking a lot about AI in particular, just thinking about fast-moving, novel, global, digitized technology, saying we need new regulatory technology. And that generates a demand for figuring out how are we going to invent new regulatory technologies? How are we going to attract the investment, the brains, into the problem of inventing new regulatory technology? So I want to describe our existing regulatory technology is, first of all, it's public sector. Primarily, it is nation-state based. It moves fairly slowly. It's deliberative. That's the technique of, if any of you participated, we go and we testify before hearings, we go talk to agencies, they hire experts, they write a set of rules. We sit around rooms like this and we say, well, how should we change this? I spent a lot of time thinking about what the lawyers are doing there, adding more words and more words and more words to that. We put that law in place, we monitor for violations, we adjudicate, and in a regulatory environment we find or sometimes stop people from practicing. And so the starting claim is that's actually not going to cut it. Doesn't cut it very well for a lot of our existing technologies here, because this is joint work with Jack Clark of OpenAI, who you will hear more from tonight. And by the way, I've just become a director of this new Schwarzer Institute for Technology and Society, which I'm extremely excited about. And I'm really, really anxious to talk to people who'd like to work with the Institute. So I'll throw that out there. Okay, how are we going to build technology that's capable of managing AI and powerful systems? The challenge, as I mentioned, is speed, complexity, it's digital, it's intangible, and it's global. And that's a real challenge for our regulatory projects. This is what I've been thinking about for the last couple of years, talk about it in the book. I've already mentioned our existing regulatory technologies, public sector, deliberative, text-based, adjudication-based, and slow. It's got limited technological expertise. We have mechanisms for getting technological expertise in there, but it's still limited to public sector incentives. It's relatively costly. May not be so costly on the front end, but it's very costly on the interpretation and adjudication end. So financial regulation, Dodd-Frank, for example, 1,000-page, maybe 2,000-page statute, tons and tons of regulatory rules from lots of overlapping, interlocking, and lots of expensive advice and interpretation that's needed to figure out how you comply. And I mentioned it's local, it's nation state, and that's not well adapted to global regulation. So here's a schematic of what our standard model of thinking about what regulation looks like. We have governments. Conventionally, they engage in command and control regulation, specifying technology, for example. And then directly regulated entities. So the proposal here is for what we're calling regulatory markets, which basically does this. This is really cool, right? Is we want to see if we can figure out how to develop a market layer of competitive private regulators. But competitive private regulators that are themselves regulated by government, they in turn provide regulatory services to our regulated entities for a fee. So this is a market. So you want to think about your private regulators. They could be nonprofit. We're thinking of profit in particular here. They're dual facing. They need to be licensed by government. And government, we urge here, shifts into outcome-based regulation, which is, say, if you want to think self-driving cars, it's a very dim example, but specify an accident rate that is politically acceptable and still legitimately determined through your political processes, but then say to private entities, hey, if you can demonstrate to us that your regulatory methods achieve our targets, you can maintain your license, you'll be licensed to operate in this market. And then we say to the self-driving car companies, you need to choose from the licensed regulators the purchase of regulatory services. And what that does is attracts money into that sector, develops expertise in that sector, and that market structure can attract investment in the invention of new regulatory technology. So the AI question mark in here is, I will often say, look, we're going to need AI to regulate AI in some dimensions. So how is that AI going to get built? Not going to get built in a public sector. It's going to need to be built in some kind of a market sector. So this is what we're trying to do, recruit markets. Now, it's not as strange as it sounds. It's actually building on lots and lots of existing private regulatory efforts. Even though we have that picture in our heads of regulation, there's tons of private regulation that already goes on. We have standard-setting bodies, the ISO, IEEE, et cetera. We have lots of voluntary standards that are created that companies choose to comply with. We have lots of regulation happening through supply chain contracts, so managing the global environment, so Nike or Walmart, so on, putting into their supply chain contracts rules about child labor, environment, health and safety in foreign plants. We have ethical guidelines within companies where they're adopting internally ethical requirements. We have certification schemes. And actually one of the closest examples to what we're going to talk about here is actually the way that the US, Canada, Brazil, Australia, and I'm forgetting who else, now use for regulating medical devices, which is to have a single audit program where they authorize certifiers of compliance with standards. And in fact, the standard is taken for most of these countries from the ISO. And then companies purchase the certification services. So we have those models already in place. There's lots of literature on new governance models, so moving away from a command and control prescriptive approach, even within the standard structure of thinking about government doing it. There's long literature here. This is about shifts to what's known as outcomes-based regulation. So that's instead of saying you got to put scrubbers in the smokestacks, right? We're going to regulate the emissions, and you choose what regulation, what kind of technology you want to adopt. Sometimes called management-based regulation as well. That's where we say, look, government goes to the firm and says, you need to evaluate what the risks and regulatory challenges are in your production process and come up with a plan for managing those, and then we will oversee based on the plan. Performance-based regulation, another term for that. Sometimes called enforced self-regulation, so it's not purely voluntary. It's that you regulate and then we'll oversee that, maybe a little bit. Or meta-regulation. See, this is the literature that's the terms that are out there. Now, I want to sort of address the ways in which the model we are talking about is not a lot of things that you may think it is. This is not self-regulation. So this is not the regulation of the 737 MAX, which is a case study we discuss in the paper. There's an independent third-party regulator. The FAA in the 737 MAX case basically said to Boeing, set up a certification office inside Boeing, your employees, you're in charge, and they did almost zero, like literally almost zero oversight of that certification within Boeing. So we're talking about the creation of independent third-party regulators. This is not regulating yourself. It's not industry self-regulation. So it's not lawyers, it's not FINRA with delegation to a membership organization like a bar association. FINRA is a nonprofit membership organization. The regulator here is regulated by government. This is shifting the role of government. I like to think it's just an analog to the shift from centrally planned economies to regulated market economies. You're just shifting the role of government up another level and putting into the market the design of the regulatory technology. But the regulator is regulated by government, and that becomes a function of government, is to regulate the regulators. So this is why this is also not the credit rating agencies' problem. The credit rating agencies were not at all regulated. In fact, they were affirmatively unregulated because it was in the legislation. We also talk about this in the paper. It was in the legislation that created the special status for Moody's and S&P and so on, that they were not to be regulated by the SEC, and they were not to be held liable in court for the reliability of their ratings. They had immunity to lawsuits for the credibility of their ratings. So we are not talking about that. This is not voluntary standards. We got lots and lots, and in the AI area, there's just an explosion of voluntary standard systems. So ISO is a voluntary standard, IEEE, et cetera. Those are voluntary standards. We are saying it's mandatory. We're looking at an environment where it's mandatory to choose a regulator. And we're trying, this is the key to how we think you can actually get the innovation of new regulatory technologies, which is, I think, what we need. Because we're talking about regulatory competition, but it's real regulatory competition. Those of you who might know the literature in law and economics on corporate law, the language of regulatory competition is used to talk about competition between states with their corporate law. And say, well, that's not really competition, right? That's competition between legislatures. That looks quite different. This is true regulatory competition. It's not that. Here's what we're trying to do. And here's a picture. Here's an example. We developed this as an example in the paper. We are looking specifically, I say, to this domain of AI safety, thinking about the audience for OpenAI in particular. One of the risks that we're exposed to with the use of machine learning is, those of you who've been following, sort of the concept of adversarial attacks, which is the idea that the models are actually subject to really very, very tiny, say in image recognition, very tiny modifications, imperceptible to the human eye, very tiny modifications to the data can cause the classification and the performance of the model to just drop off the map, get it completely wrong. So that creates both just risks of error, because there are also naturally occurring adversarial examples out there, but it could also create a vulnerability. So we're thinking, okay, imagine you've got your drone industry, lots of participants with drones using a lot of machine learning models to operate those, creates a vulnerability that if there could be hacking access or if could just be error. We have sort of a variety of different providers. You could have the Amazon using the drones, you could have drone manufacturers, you could have machine learning engineers building the models. And what we're looking at here is a multitude of regulators, R1, R2, R3 here, who are overseen by, could be an international group, could be a local domestic government, could be an agency of the government, but that's the oversight body. That's the one that's regulating the regulators. Those regulators will be innovating things like robustness techniques. So the literature on adversarial attacks in AI is replete with all kinds of efforts to build robustness techniques, different kinds of testing methods to establish the robustness of the models. Could be used developing audit systems, maintenance, licensing your engineers. Those models are paid for. They are provided. You may be required as part of your regulation to provide access to the data. That's mandatory. We're getting oversight with principles and metrics and outside, and that the regulators are producing data and reports too.